Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
This is Breakthrough News, and you are watching the Freedom Side. Shout out to everybody who's out there in viewer land. Sorry we started a little bit late today. Had to work some things out, but we are here. Do not worry. Well, I am here, I have to say. Rania Khalek is off this week, although I don't know if she's watching, so I should say this. She said to tell all of you out there in viewer land hello, and of course to remember to go ahead and hit the like button if you like the show, because that helps boost us in the algorithm. So I've done my due diligence, Rania, if you were there watching. But we want to start to get right into it. So just a few more reminders. If you are watching on YouTube, make sure you go ahead and hit the subscribe button, then hit the bell so that you get the things that you've subscribed to very easily. And of course, for those of you watching on Free Speech TV, we're just happy to have your patronage, so just continue to watch there. We'll get into some more later in terms of announcements as it regards us here at Breakthrough News, but happy to be back with you. Hopefully things are well with you in the wake, at least in the United States, of a big holiday. But a lot going on in the world, and we want to get right to that. So we want to start with the country of Pakistan, where there has been a large amount of things that have been happening over the past several weeks, including huge mass protest ongoing, and when also included some significant brutality by the police there, and also related to former Prime Minister Imran Khan, who has again today been charged with even more alleged crimes by the Pakistani government. So an increase there in tension. So very happy to have back with us here on the show as we continue here, Junaid Ahmed, who's a professor of law, religion, and global politics, and also the director of the Center for the Study of Islam and Decolonization in Islamabad. Junaid, thanks so much for being back with us.
Eugene, always a pleasure to be with you all.
Well, you know, when we first reached out to you, the big news was the huge protests that had come to Islamabad, which is, I think, still very important and very relevant. But I think we're maybe seeing some of the aftermath of that here in the last day or so. I've actually lost count of how many different criminal cases Imran Khan has been charged with, but he has been charged with yet another case here that seems to me, and tell me if you think I'm wrong, somewhat related to the fact that they can't seem to destroy the street movement that's supporting him, and they just keep layering on these charges, almost maybe as if they're trying to fatigue people, like no matter what you do, you can't release him, but people still seem to be very defiant. So maybe give us a sense of what these new charges are, and talk to us a little bit about the political scene currently.
Well, Eugene, where to begin? Although, it must be said that by this stage, no one, perhaps even the enemies of Khan, take these cases seriously. They are constantly manufactured one after the next to basically keep Khan in jail. But of course, Eugene, we are now into roughly almost 3 years since the regime change operation against Khan, Washington backed, in April of 2022. Khan had multiple assassination attempts on him. These cases started to pile up, and the only solution the military regime saw here was finally to imprison him, not just to put him in a normal jail, but like a supermax isolated prison. And so he's been there since August of 2023. And as we have discussed numerous times, the remarkable part of this whole story is the fact that as soon as the regime change against him happened, millions of supporters of Khan, even critical supporters who were sympathetic to his political party, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, Movement for Justice, have come out on the streets in their millions. And the momentum now over 2 years has not declined at all. In fact, it only increases. And so that is something which proves that however brutal and fascistic this regime is, it is even more so very dumb and stupid, because every action that it takes only increases Khan's popularity and the movement's popularity. I mean, before you could speak about 50 to 60% of the population at the time of the regime change being supportive of Khan. Now it's closer to 80, 90%. And these are validated by consistent Gallup polls showing this. And so right now, what has happened, obviously, followed the very bloody massacre, what we call the Islamabad massacre, and on November 24th. 24th was when they called for a long march. Khan called for a long march, the movement's leaders, long march to Islamabad, because for the past 2.5 years, the capital city, Islamabad, anyone's been prevented from coming there and protesting peacefully. And, again, it must be emphasize that all of the protests over these past 2.5 years have been incredibly peaceful. That has been the hallmark of this, not just now, but of Imran Khan going back to the beginning of the war on terror days. He went on fairly dangerous long marches to those areas, the tribal areas, where the brunt of the war on terror, massacres, displacement, both by the United States and NATO, as well as the Pakistani military, where the brunt of that occurred. And he went there. We had great, people and activists come from abroad, such as Medea Benjamin. So it has always been a peaceful movement. And even in Islamabad now, when they proceeded on November 24th, the military regime gave the impression initially that, okay, they tolerate this as long as they're peaceful and so on. The only confrontation really that these protesters had was with the shipping containers, which were ubiquitous everywhere. So they would climb on these shipping containers, they'd be singing, dancing, or praying. And of course, there's the image that went viral of a man who was praying on one of the shipping container, and the rangers who were deployed is before like smiling at him, and then they approach him while he's praying and throw him off the shipping container, and he died. So that kind of symbolize the type of ongoing state terror and butchery targeted against movement, and the fact that they remain so livid that this guy, Imran Khan, sitting in jail, can still galvanize these mass protests throughout the country. And again, we must remember what the balance of forces have been. You have, on the one hand, this singular figure, Imran Khan, and the movement of justice. On the other hand, you have the military elites, the generals, the two most dominant family dynastic political parties, these kleptocratic politicians. Washington, basically everything stacked against him, yet he's been able to succeed in fighting back, sitting in jail. So, to answer your question, Eugene, these cases are constantly concocted to keep him in jail, but no one takes them seriously.
Well, I think that's important context. And thinking about Washington's role, which of course is, now has been revealed, inconclusively in removing Khan. I mean, it seems that they still really want him out. I mean, if someone in Caracas gets a hangnail, then 25 people get sanctioned in Venezuela. But there's been, other than, a handful of Congress people and senators, no real attempt by the United States to try to bring to heel any of the Pakistani politicians, which means they must have some level of agreement with what they're doing. I mean, what is the U.S. interest here? Why would they want Khan gone in the first place, and why would they be so, at least indifferent, if not openly supportive, to these extreme efforts to keep him from, being freed from jail and, most likely returning to power?
Well, we should give credit to the State Department, which after this massacre took place, just like it does with Israel, it called upon the Pakistani military to investigate itself in its role in the massacre. So yes, I mean, that was what came from the State Department. Although, Eugene, it must be emphasized that, of course, while these characters, the military elites and the political elites that the United States installed after the regime change against Khan, they have, been disastrous, right? So what was considered at the beginning as a great asset in completely erasing the politics of Khan and his movement, particularly on the question of Pakistani foreign policy, where Khan really advocated an independent, sovereign foreign policy that would not be enemies with anyone, including Washington. But of course, as the famous cipher or the diplomatic cable revealed, the United States could not tolerate Khan's aggressive neutrality. That was the term they used, and that had to do with, I always say that's kind of was the last straw that broke the camel's back, because there are a lot of other reasons, whether it's his support for Palestine and Kashmir and all sorts of other positions, and of course his more than 20-year opposition to the war on terror. I think that is the essential background. And the last straw that broke the camel's back was his, in the timing he didn't control, his visit to Moscow and Putin on the day that he launched the special military operation in Ukraine. So, I think that the Washington perceived the removal of Khan, the removal of the Khan virus, as presenting an opportunity to restore their control and domination through their political and military lackeys. But it's been such a catastrophic disaster, right? So at this point, it does seem like, Eugene, that they are seeing their clownish representatives here in Pakistan as more of a liability than an asset at this point. So and that's the context in which more and more members of Congress are speaking up. And of course, Trump had this kind of personal relationship with Khan, right? I mean, it's not like Khan admired anything about Trump, but when they met together, you know how easily Trump can be impressed by these types of figures. And so the Pakistani American community feels that, Trump, because of that personal relationship, will be on the side of Khan. Who knows? I mean, just being personally, friendly with them doesn't necessarily translate into policy shifts. But on the one hand, but the larger context is what I'm saying. Their deep frustration in the ability of this regime that they installed to, produce the results, do the bidding of Washington, right? And the United States, the previous chief of army staff, who always, of course, that's what they despise about Khan. For the first time in the history of Pakistan, right? Khan has, usurped the mantle of, Pakistani nationalism in a progressive way, not in, in a third worldist way. Whereas in the past, the military would always propagate a story in which it is the guardian of Pakistan. It's collapsed. And that's why, Khan we see these constant, like really extreme actions against Khan. And one wonders, what's the story here? It's the deep, anger. They are completely irate at the fact that Khan is so popular, and their traditional base of support in particularly the largest province of Punjab, that has gone. Punjabis who they expected to love the military, or at least respect it, now despise it. And this is all because of Khan. So, they have their own agenda, but I'm not sure if it serves Washington anymore, right? And so, the previous Chief of Army Staff, General Bajwa, who was the guy who kind of on the ground orchestrated the regime change. He went to Washington and said, because of the China relationship of Pakistan, he's like to please his masters in Washington. He says, I really don't even like Chinese food, right? To kind of send a signal how he's kind of anti-China as well. And the new chief of army staff, has accomplished this great feat of being even more despised than the previous chief of army staff, Bajwa, the current chief of army staff. And by the way, I apologize for any dog barking in the background. This is a time where we need to keep a lot of guard dogs around us in this country. But the latest, the new chief of army staff, General Asim Munir, this guy is directly or indirectly complicit in the targeting and murder of Chinese workers in Pakistan, right? And he's completely destroyed. The Chinese are not dumb either. They are now limiting their investment in this kind of flagship project of the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative in Pakistan, called CPEC, the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor. They have, stopped, investing, have kind of stopped the kind of infrastructure construction, knowing full well the games that Islamabad is playing, and still trying to desperately be the servants of Washington right now.
Well, a lot here and a lot to keep sorting through. And Junaid, we always appreciate your willingness to come on and help us sort through it. And I think there'll be more to say December 13th, another big protest day. But Junaid Ahmed, thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much, Eugene.
Well, a lot to watch there is really, quite something to see what took place in the big protest a few weeks ago in Islamabad, overcoming all security measures there. And, 12 people at least killed there during those protests. But we'll keep covering it. We'll keep following it. And, one of the most important countries really in the Asian sphere, but one of the least talked about in the U.S. media. So that's something that we'll continue to bring you here from Breakthrough News. And, of course, we want to continue the show here by looking at the broader region of West Asia, where, listen, where do we start? There's so many things going on. The ongoing genocide, the quote unquote ceasefire in Lebanon, and now, of course, the conflagration in Syria and the escalation of conflict there, all of which, of course, are sort of reinforcing on each other and on other countries as we have the sort of ongoing regional war, I guess is the best way to discuss it, given how interconnected it all is. So we are very honored to have with us here on the show once again, Giorgio Cafiero, who is the CEO of Gulf States Analytics. Giorgio, thanks so much for being back with us.
Good to be with you.
Well, great to have you here for a number of reasons. Thinking Syria, I think, is the thing that's on everyone's mind. There's obviously a million things that we could say here. One of the things I maybe want to start with is it feels like a very different moment, even though a lot of the issues internally to Syria are sort of the same. It's an ongoing conflict. But to see many of the countries, UAE and others, in the Gulf states especially, who had been very supportive of the opposition in different ways in the first round of the conflict in Syria, now at least rhetorically standing with Assad. I mean, how do you really see that? I mean, I know they've been normalizing, but how do you sort of see that? Is it just rhetoric? Would they still like to see Assad go? Or is it really kind of a new moment where the Gulf states are now not as keen to see the potential implications and fallout from an increased conflict in Syria?
Yeah, I think it's really significant the extent to which we can observe a real change in how GCC states are responding to the unfreezing of the Syrian civil war late last month and this month compared to how they were responding in the sort of 2011 to 2015 period at the start of the Syrian crisis. I think probably the GCC state that's most important and most interesting to look at here is the United Arab Emirates. The UAE was one of the Arab countries that was supporting the opposition early on in the GCC crisis, in the Syria crisis, but not only within the GCC, but within the wider Arab world in the last 4 or 5 years or so. The UAE has really been the main country serving as sort of a hub for the renormalization process between the Assad government and other Arab governments. Abu Dhabi really has invested quite a bit of diplomatic energy into trying to shore up the Syrian government. The reasons why are important to look at. We can certainly get into that if you'd like, but the bottom line is the UAE has invested a lot in Assad since late 2018. The UAE has been putting on many different conferences to try to bring other Gulf states and other Arab states on board with plans for the redevelopment and reconstruction of post-conflict Syria. Bashar al-Assad himself has been paying visits to the UAE beginning in March 2022. So right now, the leadership in Abu Dhabi does not want to see the Syrian government fall. And also, when we look at some of the rebel factions that have been playing an important role in this ongoing offensive, which seems to continue gaining momentum and seems to have a lot of energy. Last week, there was their takeover of Aleppo. Just earlier today, the rebels took control of Hama. And given that some of these groups are ideologically tied to the Islamists and jihadists, the leadership in Abu Dhabi does not want to see groups like this in the Arab world taking control of parts of Syria, to say nothing about the prospects for these armed groups overthrowing the Syrian government. So right now, the UAE and certainly some other Arab states that were sympathetic to the opposition over a decade ago, they very much want to see Assad weather this storm. And I think they'll be supportive of the Syrian Arab army's efforts with the support of Russia to wage a counter-offensive. Now, that being said, none of these GCC states, I think, are going to get involved militarily, but that's not to negate the fact that they have very high stakes in what's going on in Syria right now.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think that's important context, and it feels, and maybe I'm wrong about this, so I'm definitely open to your correction, that there's there's some of a connection too to what we've seen with the sort of Iran-Saudi rapprochement and Iran and the other Gulf states, that there's more of an alignment in the region. I mean, to see the Iranian foreign minister go from Damascus, then go to Turkey, then try to say we want to revive the Astana format, that whatever differences there may be between a lot of these countries, and I'm sure there's quite a few, that there might be a growing consensus amongst more countries in the Middle East that they need a more sort of peaceful regional dispensation, and many of the conflicts that have been taking place, over the past decade or so, are counterproductive. And it seems like maybe there's some synergy as well between Iran and some of the Arab states on this issue in a way that there hasn't been in the past also.
Yeah, it's really important to keep in mind that Saudi Arabia and the UAE, on one hand, have a much warmer relationship with Iran than they did in previous years. We have seen these countries in the GCC, including those which have over the years tended to embrace very anti-Iranian positions. They have sort of been in a state of détente with Iran, and that always has to be kept in mind when we assess the ways in which they're responding to crises in the region. I think for the GCC countries, such as Saudi Arabia and UAE, they certainly have suspicions of Iran, and likewise, Iran certainly has its suspicions of these Arab countries that are very close to the U.S. as well. And Iran certainly is very opposed to the UAE's efforts to bring more Arab countries into normalization deals with Israel. But Iran is trying to obviously improve its ties with neighboring countries to counter the effects of Western pressure, and these GCC countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE want more stability in the region, and they think that their improved relations with Iran are important from the standpoint of achieving greater security and stability in the region. I think they obviously worry to some extent about how Iran might react to the crisis in Syria. And we obviously saw, I think it was on the 2nd of this month, Reuters published a piece about how Emirati officials, the leadership in Abu Dhabi, is in talks with Washington about sort of plans for trying to get an exchange in place whereby the U.S. lifts its crippling sanctions on Syria in exchange for Syria reducing its ties with Iran. So I think some of the GCC countries, such as the UAE, are trying to be very opportunistic about the HTS-led offensive on Aleppo and seeing if there are things they can do to sort of push back against Iran in Syria, which is a longstanding objective. But nonetheless, to your point, we're at a period now where the tensions between Abu Dhabi and Tehran and Riyadh and Tehran are much lower as a consequence of the genocide in Gaza. There's even some degree of Saudi-Iranian alignment that would have been very difficult to have tried to imagine a couple of years ago. So I think probably the GCC countries are going to be, in upcoming weeks, upcoming months, talking with the Iranians as well as the Turks and the Russians and doing what they can to try to see to it that any chaos in Syria doesn't spill into other countries, and to try to do whatever they can to sort of stabilize the situation in Syria within the context of their previous efforts to sort of shore up the Syrian government and rehabilitate the image of Assad in the Arab world.
I wonder what you make of the Turkish role here. I mean, of course, the Turkish government says that they have no involvement in this offensive, and that they are watching it like everyone else is. I think that many other people feel that is not really backed up by the facts of what they've done in northern Syria and various areas since then. I'm curious your thoughts on just that issue in and of itself. But if there is some possibility they are involved, what would be their motivation to opening this front up right at this particular moment?
Yeah, definitely. So there's no denying the fact that there are rebel groups in Idlib, such as HTS and others who are sort of under the HTS and SNA umbrella, which absolutely hates the Assad government, and they have their own interests in trying to topple Assad. And I certainly don't want to deny the fact that these groups have some agency, and it would not be accurate to say that Turkey is controlling everything. But at the same time, I think it's fair to come to the conclusion that this offensive happened because there was a green light from Ankara. At the end of the day, Syria's northwestern governorate of Idlib is kind of a Turkish protectorate, if you will. So to say that the Turkish government has nothing to do with what's going on would definitely be a stretch. But again, at the same time, to claim that this is all controlled by Turkey is also a misrepresentation of what's going on. As I said, there certainly was a green light that Ankara gave. And I think getting to your question about what motivations Ankara had, it's important for us to go back to previous points this year and even earlier on, really beginning in 2017, there has been an interest in restoring the diplomatic relationship between the Turkish and Syrian government. So as your viewers know, early on in the Syrian crisis, the Turkish government was all in when it came to the regime change agenda in Syria. But due to Russia's intensified military intervention in 2015, the Turkish leadership came to the conclusion that Bashar al-Assad and his regime were not going anywhere, and they had to sort of come to terms with the reality of Assad's survival. At that point, Ankara really focused on fighting the PKK-linked YPG in Syria rather than pushing a regime change agenda in Syria. And so, as I was saying, from 2017 onward, there have been, under Russian auspices, talks and efforts to bring Turkey and Syria into a renormalization agreement. Earlier this year, those talks were going on, but on the Damascus side, there was a tremendous amount of confidence. You know, back in 2023, Syria returned to the Arab League. We had years of all these different Arab regimes renormalizing with Damascus. And so the Syrian leadership was very rigid and very firm, very maximalist in their demands to Ankara, basically saying we can renormalize relations, but these are going to be on the terms of Damascus, and we're not going to concede much, if anything at all, to the Turkish side. And that infuriated the Turkish government. The leadership in Ankara thought that the Syrian government needed to make real concessions to the Turkish side. And basically, we had a stalemate, and the normalization talks did not progress. So I think Ankara's motivation here was to greenlight this rebel offensive and let Assad's government know that if Damascus was not going to concede anything to Ankara and come to the talks with these very maximalist positions, Turkey had some cards to play that could make things very difficult for Assad's government. So on one level, I think this was about trying to enhance Turkey's bargaining power, not to overthrow the Syrian government, but to get Assad to come back to the negotiating table and concede more to Turkey than he was willing to do. A final point I'll add, though, is that it's possible for this rebel offensive to be, from the rebels' perspective, much more successful than Ankara expected. And if these rebels move on to Homs and possibly move on to Damascus and topple Assad's government, there's not going to be a government in Syria that Turkey can easily negotiate with. So I think policymakers in Ankara need to consider the possibility of this rebel offensive going much further than they had anticipated when they decided to greenlight it.
No, I think that's all very relevant. Last couple of minutes here. I mean, this is speculative question, so it's hard to answer. But I mean, it does feel, you think from October 7th on that there's a real shifting sands here in the broader West Asian region. I mean, it feels like so many of the things that, and it's been changing for a while, but I'm 38, that the sort of rhythm you get used to of who's for who, who's against who, the different countries, the different borders even, that have their own history, that a lot of that is all just in flux now. And that so much of that was sort of ignited by this resurgence of the Palestinian cause after what took place on October 7th and what we've seen in the war between the Palestinians and Israel. I don't know what you think about that, or if you think this is a sort of broader inflection point moment for the region, but just curious your thoughts if you had any.
Well, there are definitely some very important shifts taking place in the region. I think it's sort of tough to deny that as a consequence of Israel's warfare in Lebanon, in which they have delivered very serious blows to Hezbollah. They have attacked strategic points along the Lebanese-Syrian border, and they have spent years bombing groups in Syria that are linked to Iran. I think it's a little difficult to deny the fact that the axis of resistance has been weakened, certainly not eliminated, but there has been a consequence of uh, Israeli military operations against Iran-linked groups in the region, in Lebanon and Syria mostly, that consequently results in the Assad government being in a weaker position. And I think some of these rebel groups in Idlib clearly saw an opportunity to take advantage of the relative weakness of the axis of resistance. And this really speaks to the fact that the Syrian government, really since the conflict froze in 2020, has been very dependent on Iran and Lebanon's Hezbollah. And when these forces, these regional allies of Damascus, are in a weaker place, that has made Damascus much weaker. This is to say nothing about the fact that Syria's ultimate security guarantor, Russia, doesn't have the bandwidth that it had before the conflict in Ukraine took place in February 2022. So Assad does not have his allies in the position to come to his defense that they were in the position to do earlier on in the conflict. Now, at this point, this raises so many questions about how these recent developments in Syria that are chaotic and very fluid can spill into other countries, Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, possibly into the Gulf region as well. It's really a very, very chaotic situation in Syria, incredibly difficult to predict how things will unfold. But to say the least, it's a very, very fluid crisis right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, the good news for Breakthrough News viewers is we have people like Giorgio Cafiero, CEO of Gulf State Analytics, to help us walk through it all step by step as it happens. Giorgio, as always, really appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Also want to shout out, I think it's Tragedy Equals Comedy, for your donation. Thank you very much. Thanks so much to Giorgio also for joining us. Again, a lot of issues. There are just a lot of different threads to pull on here, and we'll keep following them for you as best we can. But a good reason, if you're watching on YouTube, to go ahead and hit the subscribe button and hit the bell so that you get the alerts for the things that you subscribe to, because we're going to have to be putting out a lot more content, as you can see. Another reason you should go to patreon.com/breakthrough-news. If you can, become a patron and a donor, so that way that we can, well, I guess patron and donor is the same thing, but whatever. Give whatever you can. It's all greatly appreciated. Obviously, there's no shortage of things that need significant in-depth coverage. It's different from the mainstream media. Well, now we want to move into the Sahel region of Africa, particularly Niger, which is one of the three members of the Alliance of Sahel States, along with Mali and Burkina Faso, that have been drawing the attention of the world after they've kicked out French soldiers in all three, and in the context of Niger, also kicked out the American base and troops, which is, very rare in this day and age. And there's a lot of people wondering what's been going on with these popular uprisings, the military governments that have come from them, the kicking out of the various troops. So we are very honored to talk more about Niger by Alex Onfruns-Meillan, who's a journalist, a political analyst, and the author of the new book, Niger, Just Another Coup or a Pan-African Revolution, which I have to say is a great text. I really enjoyed it. Easy to read, from 1804 Books, 1804books.com. Alex, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Eugene. It's a pleasure.
The pleasure is all ours, and a lot we could get into here. And so this may be the first of a couple conversations, but let's start here. One of the things I think is important is, with the Niger and the Sahel more broadly, giving people some context about what they're seeing here with the mass protests, the popular uprisings, the new governments, like what's really driving them. And I wonder if you could give us some context about that in terms of poverty and other issues that really led people to rise up in such a profound way.
Well, extreme poverty has characterized the Sahel for the last decades. Especially about every 2 decades, there has been a famine crisis in Niger. However, there is a blatant contradiction between the situation where the extreme poverty has prevailed and the exploitation of the fabulous resources that under the soil, and like uranium in the case of Niger. The exploitation of the uranium started in 1971 by a unique French company, Areva, which was a monopoly. This company had got extremely wealthy, while Niger had become one of the less developed countries in the world, according to the United Nations Programme for Human Development. So we should take both elements into consideration. We cannot take them separately. Just before the coup d'etat happened at the end of July 2023, the extreme poverty had reached 42% of the Nigerian population. And that was under Bazoum's presidency, who was considered as a democratic government. And I wonder what kind of regime left behind half of the population and still pretend to be a democracy. There was a complicity and there was a culpability amongst many of those actors. You know, the extreme poverty manifests in the lack of job opportunities, lack of education, access to electricity, healthcare, and so on. But besides all of these problems that the population was already facing, we should add the rise of terrorism. When young people cannot make a living and have a future with dignity, some of them become a prey of the armed groups that eventually use the religion as a pretext. So that was the case in Niger, but also in Burkina Faso and Mali. And definitely the poverty, but also corruption-based system has fueled the problems. And the consequence of that, the military took the power in order to reverse the situation.
You know, I'm really glad that you raised that issue, because so much of the conversation in the West, when Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso were kicking out the French troops, in the case of Niger, kicking out the U.S. troops, the drone base and everything, the focus was on terrorism and how these countries were, you know, now going to basically collapse under terrorism because these Western armies have been playing such an important role. And I wonder how you think about that. I know there's been a lot of you know, sort of criticism of the role of these foreign forces in the Sahel. I mean, were they really there to fight terrorism, or is it more of what I heard, certainly when I was recently in Niger, that the real purpose of these forces was to control the countries?
I think this is a speech that must be heard. Actually, on this point, the Malian government made a formal accusation against France that was addressed to the United Nations Security Council. It says that France had been fueling this phenomenon of terrorism instead of fighting against it. It's a strong accusation, and it deserves an investigation that still has to be made. In fact, this accusation is based on a contradiction. Since France's military intervention in Mali, 2012, the French military strategy has proven to be a failure. It has been admitted by the major chief of the French army, who said that they must stay in the Sahel at least for 30 years more, which means until the year 2050. Of course, the African military officers in the Sahel have been confronted with the harsh reality of war on the ground. And that means also the lack of proper equipment, nor the modern weaponry that would have permitted them to defeat the terrorist groups. But it was denied to them by French army. And consequently, it became an occupier in the view of the African officers like Assimi Goïta and Ibrahim Traoré. They asked themselves, how come one of the most modern armies is not able to defeat those terrorist groups? So they came to power after having concluded that the French strategy was unsuccessful. And not only that, they have also concluded that instead of helping them to defeat the terrorists, the Western armies have been supporting both sides in order to justify the presence of Western companies in the Sahel, especially when the Chinese started to have a bigger influence since the beginning of the 2000s. Of course, the reason is that there are fabulous economic interests in the Sahel. So there is a strong suspicion about the role of Western armies that must be taken into consideration. It deserves an investigation, not made by Western nor UN observers, but by an African mission in order to reinforce and defend its sovereignty. So I would say that the real challenge is helping to defend the Sahel states against its enemies by finding the truth. It is vital for them to express clearly their views and to condemn the Western interference. I want to read a document.
Please.
It is a letter addressed to the United Nations Security Council, signed by Abdoulaye Diop, which is the foreign minister of Mali. Just a part of it. The government of Mali has several pieces of evidence indicating that France has made use of those flagrant violations of Malian airspace to collect intelligence for the benefit of terrorist groups operating in the Sahel and to drop arms and ammunition to them. So for me, it's clear.
No, I think that's critically important and something I hope to see investigated more. It has to be heard and not dismissed as a conspiracy theory. One thing that you were certainly referencing, and I think we've all seen, I mean, in Niger, all the countries of the Alliance of Sahel states, which I think it's also worth noting are also very young countries, the desire for more development is very clear. So I wonder what analysis you make here. I mean, it's still the early stages of all of these governments, but in the, for brief period we've had so far, what analysis you would make of the progress made by Niger and other countries on addressing some of these development issues that have been neglected by past governments?
Actually, I defend the idea that there is a Pan-African revolution, and the facts are confirming my writings. For me, definitely, the CNSP authorities in Niger have been taking important steps in order to help the population. They share the idea that it is thanks to the people that today we are seeing a new dynamics in the Sahel, not only in Niger. So the changes don't come from the top, they come from below. First, people have been demonstrating its support to the CNSP authorities under the threat of a war. Secondly, because of the blockade, people have been living many months without the most basic needs like food and electricity. Finally, thanks to the African solidarity and the creation of the Alliance of the Sahel states, there were truck corridors coming from Burkina Faso that helped the Nigerian people. That's how Niger have overcome those difficulties when the coup d'etat happened, and there were many hostilities against it. So, in response to that, the CNSP authorities have understood that there is the people that has to continue playing the main role in the upcoming days. I will quote a remarkable speech that has been pronounced by President Tiani, which essentially says that the people must finally benefit from Niger's national resources. And this has been repeated many times by the CNSP authorities. Since the coup, it's becoming usual to see different measures taken by the CNSP in order to help Nigerian people, especially the medical measures. And as you may know, there is a lack of health centers and facilities in many African countries. Most of the existing structures are private. Then, most of the time, people don't have enough money to cover basic medical needs. Now the CNSP have reduced to half the price many health services. And for the first time, thousands of people can get access to healthcare. So these actions are being taken to dignify people, especially people without a regular job and families that are lacking resources. Now, the CNSP are not only helping people on a material level, but also on an intellectual one. They are currently raising awareness on the real causes that lies behind the problems of underdevelopment. CNSP is now helping historians to rewrite African history, because until now, only old French colonial power was able to put its version of history into people's mind. So in many aspects, there is a complete reversal of the situation in the Sahel. And to me, popular education is key in the current phase of the revolution.
I'm glad you raised the issue of Pan-African revolution, because I think, a lot of the discussion around the Alliance of Sahel states, in the West at least, is sort of about Russia and, the Niger, Mali, whoever, are just portrayed as subjects, like they are they're being puppeteered by Russia or China or whoever it may be. But I wonder if in this context of multipolarity that everyone's talking about, we should start to see the Alliance of Sahel states as a pole in and of itself, as an African pole that's emerging and offering its own contributions to the overall sort of world situation.
In my view, the Sahel Pan-African revolution is defined the capitalist system. As Samir Amin explained very well, in creating a bloc of African countries that changes the situation, because these are economies that are specializing in sending raw materials to abroad, and this is not a system that can stand anymore. I think we talked about multipolarity. It is a fact that it has been changing the face of the world in the last years. And I would say that this is a new Cold War situation, with NATO having a key role in the destabilization of the South. NATO is seeking to attack multipolarity. NATO's aim is to rule the world, impeding countries like China to become serious competitors vis-à-vis the US empire. NATO's strategy is designed to avoid that, no matter how much chaos is being spread in the meantime. So definitely, multipolarity has got stronger after the creation of the Confederation of Sahel States. And we can see now, Senegal and Chad governments are also saying that they will send the French army back home. As we can see, dynamics of the Sahel state is just at the beginning. It's an upheaval, considering the situation that has prevailed since the African independence in the 60s decade. Niger government established new partnerships with countries like Iran, Turkey, Russia, or China in the beginning of this year. And it was a decisive step that permitted to defeat the strategy of ECOWAS, based on a blockade and cruel illegal sanctions against the Nigerian people. So it is vital to reinforce this counter-hegemonic bloc of African countries against the imperialist powers. It allows millions of people across the African continent to expect a better future for their children. Of course, there is to be expected that France and other Western countries will try to attempt against the stability and sovereignty of the Sahel states. I want to conclude by this idea. The Confederation of the Sahel States are good news for people's struggles in the global south because they are seeking for a true development. But it deserves also to be known in the north. José Martí, a guerrilla fighter against the Spanish colonialism, said, "People must know each other as if they were starting to fight a battle together." For me, this is so important. We have to know the history of Niger and the Sahel because we have a lot in common. It is a common fight against capitalism, against neocolonialism and imperialism. So for me, it's very good news.
Well, it's very good news for us that you wrote about it, and a fantastic book that you were able to write there, Alex. The Niger, Just Another Coup or a Pan-African Revolution. You can get it from 1804books.com. I'd tell you it's a short book. It's easily written. Anyone can read it, but it's filled with facts. If you're interested in Niger, the Sahel, you have to read it. Alex, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
It's my pleasure. Thanks.
Yes, very short book. I really can, I'm going to tell you the number of pages so people, I know, look, it's 2024, people don't want to read, that's my little commentary here. 90 pages, come on, anyone can read this, 1804books.com. It really is a fantastic text, and it's important that we have the context, which, Alex gives in the book about the history of Niger, the history of the neo-colonial regime that has been in place for many, many years now, since the early 1960s. I mean, all of these different pieces and the profound changes that are happening there is, some people who follow Breakthrough News may be aware, and if you don't follow Breakthrough News, you may not be aware. I was recently in Niger. I was there for about a week at a conference that was there, the designed to build solidarity with what was happening in the Alliance of Sahel States. So it was in Niger, mainly Nigerians, but a number of other people who were coming from Mali and Burkina Faso, and then second to that, different parts of the African continent, and then a few of us who were there from outside of the continent. But I think the themes that, Alex picks up on there are very well taken, and you see the changes that are happening there in the country. I mean, he mentioned the issue of healthcare, for instance, and the 50% reduction in cost in public healthcare. The other side of that is the attempt to rehabilitate many of the rural healthcare centers that have, deteriorated over the context of this, the past several governments going back a number of years now. I was reading in, recently, I think in just 2 of the regions, a plan to rehabilitate, I want to say the number was 210, but I don't have it in front of me, so I could be wrong, but dozens and dozens and dozens of healthcare centers that are going on there. You can see that the government is also moving forward to promote irrigation in many different parts of the country. It's a Sahel, so, it's a challenging area, especially with the rise of climate change vis-a-vis the issue of agriculture. So you can see a lot of government support that's coming in on building irrigation and other pieces like that allow people to, farmers, small farmers, it's still the vast majority of the country living in rural areas, have the opportunity, to really be able to grow their crops and then, of course, take them to market and make some money. They're working on rural electrification. I saw about, I think it's 47 villages that they have just announced that, it's to start, 47 villages. They're going to build like micro power plants so that they can actually have access to electricity. And of course, and Alex mentioned this just recently, I mean, this is a country that, their supply of uranium to France is one of the key things of keeping the lights on in France. But the vast majority of people inside of Niger don't have access to electricity, especially in rural areas. So they're moving in that regard too. Uranium is obviously big there. Gold is also big in Niger. There's other sort of minerals in the ground. And, obviously this is one of the main issues in all of Africa, quite frankly, is the extraordinarily low amount of money that flows back into the African countries, from these just massive mineral wealth. And Niger, as you might imagine, is no different. I mean, I can't remember where it is, but it's like Niger is almost always bottom 10 of the poorest countries in the world, but yet and still it's actually one of the richest countries in terms of actual material goods. They also have just started pumping oil out of there, which is why Niger has also, ironically enough, since the new government has come into power, become the fastest growing economy in Africa and on earth. It's an interesting stat. It's mainly related to the growth of the oil trade, but also to some degree gold. So, you got to give some caveats to that, but it's still relevant because you can see the increase in the share of wealth. This is what the government is one of the things that they've been focusing on. So prior to the new government coming in Niger, if they so chose, the same is also true in Mali, Burkina Faso, a number of other African countries. The government, statutorily has some stake in any companies. So it's sort of like everything's a joint venture when you come in and mine if they want to. They don't have to do that. So some percentage of that money, of whatever's made by that company, that joint venture, is going to come back to the country and at least ostensibly could be used for the people. Now, that wasn't really happening in terms of the money that was coming back, but also the government capped their own role at 15%. The new government has raised that to 40%. So that's, a very significant increase in terms of the percentage of wealth that can be taken out of these mining deals in the other companies that are coming in. And, this is in Mali, not Niger, but I think relevant to this point, it's notable that Mali has recently recovered about $480 million in just the past few months from tax evasion from Australian and Canadian companies. $480 million in just a few months. And there's actually more coming. It's an amazing story if you want to look into what's happening in Mali. They're doing these negotiations, and they're putting the CEOs, often these companies, in jail. So they fly into Mali, they think they're going to do their negotiations, they're going to do their thing. The Malians are confronting them saying, hey, you've been stealing a lot of money, what's going on? Then they're putting them in jail. They just actually introduced today, I think, an international arrest warrant for the head of Barrick Gold, who's a big mining CEO, and there's a big back and forth there. So, of course, it's being played in the Western media like Mali and these other countries are just lawless bandits. But you can see, Africa is a country where there's something $80-some-odd billion in what are called illicit financial flows leaving the continent every year. And that's, probably a low estimate. And illicit financial flows are just looting the country. That's basically what it means, just looting the country. And a lot of times it's these tax evasion and other things. So you can see these governments in the Alliance of Sahel states are starting to claw back that money. They're not just increasing, what they're going to get in the future, but they're going after these companies and demanding that they renegotiate their contracts to conform with the idea that they need to be paying more into the countries in the future, but also to, get the money back that they've stolen, or as much of it as they can. And then we are seeing it deployed there. The final thing I'll say before we go to our next guest is, being there for a week at the conference, thousands of people attended this conference, as mainly Nigerians, people coming from the grassroots, huge amount of popular support you could see. It's obvious, just all over the place, but coming from the mobilized people, like these big protests you're seeing in Niger outside the French military base. This is not just like random people showing up on their own power. I mean, these are a wide range of organizations with different beliefs and different philosophies, but a broader overarching agenda. And I think that was one of the really interesting things to see and to be able to dialogue with trade unionists and teachers and peasant organizers and just, people off the street, just whatever their job may be, who just were there because they are down for the cause and down for the struggle and are working with their friends and their neighbors and their coworkers to develop, a strong popular pushback against the attempts to continue to destabilize these countries. So a lot more to say about that, a lot more I could say about that, a lot more I will say about that in the upcoming weeks. But make sure that you go to, if you're on our YouTube page, you're already there, but especially our social media where we were able to share some excerpts from that conference, some of the things that went on, and it ended, by the way, in a solidarity rally with Palestine. So that was pretty cool to be marching in the streets of Niamey from the conference center to the Thomas Sankara Memorial in support of the Palestinian people, and I think a highlight of the event. So thanks to Alex for coming on, and please, please, please get this book from 1804books.com. We want to move to our next guest here now, who, believe it or not, also has a book from 1804 Books that we are releasing. So I don't know how much I even want to say about the book, because at 6:30, myself and the author will be talking again, so you can see it on the People's Forum YouTube. But either way, very happy to have with us here on the show, turning to Europe, but really the world, by Peter Mertens, who's a minister of parliament there in Belgium, a leader of the Workers' Party of Belgium, and as I mentioned, author of the new and excellent book, Mutiny, How Our World is Tilting. Peter, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Eugene.
Well, listen, I want to say a little something about the book, but I don't want to do too much, because in just about 2 hours, people can watch us at the People's Forum YouTube, have a book launch here. But I do want to start because I think it's a great text. Mutiny is a great title. And I just had to ask you, Mutiny, How Our World is Tilting. What brought you to that analogy to title the book?
A good question. There's a lot of layers. But first of all, thanks to Fiona Hill, who was a member of the National Security Council here in the United States. And when after the war in Ukraine, the proxy war in Ukraine, a lot of the countries of the global south said no against the sanctions against Russia. Like Fiona Hill, she said, whoa, that's a mutiny. And I thought, okay, if not listening to the voice of Washington is a mutiny, let's embrace this mutiny. And so that's one layer. Obviously, the tilting world, the coming of the BRICS countries, etc. But on the other level, I saw also in Europe and in the United States, there's a lot of people's movement, but because some people think everyone, the working class, is sleeping in all this. No, there is a turmoil, there is a lot of anger, there is a lot of a rage, I think, in Europe and in the United States, in the working class, but it's not politicized yet. It can go in any directions. But it's a task, I think, for a working class party to grasp this rage and to take this rage and this mutiny of the global north and to try to connect it with the rage in the global south. You just discussed the situation in the Sahel and the rage there against imperialism. And at the end of the day, it's the same system. At the end of the day, it's the same corporations, it's the same greedy imperialistic system that's causing all this problem. And so we would try to connect the dots, to connect the mutiny of the global south and the mutiny of the global north. And that's the metaphorical layer in the book. But yeah, I love mutiny.
Yeah. Well, listen, it was right on time. I started reading your book when I was also watching the documentary about pirates. So it worked out, very significantly. But, I think one of the things about the book that's notable, and you were just speaking about this, connecting the global north with the global south, you have, the book starts with vignettes from people from all around the world. And it just seems so consciously internationalist in so many different ways. And I guess I wonder, when we think about how you mentioned the world could go either way, it really does feel like there's a lot of, it's the capitalists versus the people, as it always is. But the deployment of nationalism has become so significant by the far right around the world. And it feels like that's a big conversation, the nationalist versus an internationalist vision.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so all these slogans of "Make America Great Again," "Make Germany Great Again," and in an imperialist point of view, this class collaboration view, there is no class collaboration. There is no us in Europe. There is no us in Belgium. The working class is suffering. The working class in UK is suffering. The working class in Germany is suffering. They're suffering. There is levels of poverty in London, in Berlin, they're relatively new for Europe. People may think because the global standards are relatively high still, but in working class people having full-time jobs and going to the food bank at the end of the month, it's not only a thing in the United States, it's becoming a thing in Europe itself. And so there is a working class producing all the wealth, and there is the stealing class, the talking class and the stealing class having all the surprofits at the same moment. And so I think our identity is an international identity as a working class. Make the working class great again. Have a working class perspective and believe in the cause also of a socialist project. Believe, because people at the end of the day, they won't join losers. In Europe, we had a tendency of some clubs, and they were talking about fascism 2.0. And if you were not depressed entering the conference, you surely were depressed leaving the conference. But that is not an emancipatory trajectory. We have to make the working class and people, all this system, Eugene, I think everywhere, is feeling ordinary people small, very small. The system is like that. And I think empowering politics, Marxist politics, socialist politics, is making people feel great again, part of the wealth producing class, part of a larger identity, which is a working class and which is by itself internationally. And so we can recreate this belonging, this feeling, this solidarity aspect on all levels, not only on the economic level, but also on the emotional, practical level, the meeting level, that's I think there's a world to win there, not in the talking way, also in the doing way.
No, I think that's a great point, and you're speaking to it in some ways. But thinking about the Belgian experience, I mean, I think I will take the liberty of saying a lot of people around the world have been looking very positively at the PTB because it looks very bleak across Europe with the far right. But you all have had some big breakthroughs and some big successes at a number of different levels, from local to parliamentary. And I wonder what you think others, I mean, every situation is different, people can take from your experience and your work in terms of, actually starting to push back against this drift to the right by liberals and the so-called right wing.
No, first of all, I think, thanks for the compliments, but still a lot of work to do. And we are pupils, and in order to be a teacher, you have to be a pupil all our life. And we're in a learning business. Everyone in the left is in learning, and we can learn from a lot of experience. Our experience is we believe in a socialist project. We believe in the power of our conviction. And it's very important because, like I said, people won't join loser. And it's not like the right wing have no project. So they have a project, they have a capitalist project, they have a certain view on humanity, which is vicious, which is exploitative, which is racist, but it's a certain view. And our worldview is strong. We have the global majority in the world, also in our worldview, our sense of humanity, our sense how to cope with Earth, how to cope with labor, etc. We can win a world with our worldview. So we have to believe first in our worldview. We have to believe in our class, in the working class, and not on the talking level again, but on the doing level. We are living like the PTB. We are anchored in people's quarters. We are anchored in the factories everywhere. And we're talking every day. It's an everyday job. It's an everyday job to convince someone not to vote for the European version of Trump, but to vote for us. Hey, there is no magic way. It's a way of everyday's work and life. And if you have this wave of young militants, it's a positive thing. And then third thing, so first, believe in your own conviction. Secondly, working class identity as a party. And third, an internationalist view and a humble view. We are in a learning business. And I think that and time is a perspective that you can regain, because some people ask us, what's the magic of? There is no magic. The magic is work at the base in the factories, talking with the people, having conviction, study, having experience, and etc. And also sometimes hit a wall and make votes. But it's no problem. If you're a learning person, you need some votes to regain, and that's the thing we do, and that's the thing I think at the end of the day we all do.
Well, and you open the book with some reflections on Palestine and the movement that has erupted around the world, and I'm just curious how you view the impact of that. I mean, it's been a great connector, I think, of people around the world who care about justice. But what do you think it's added to our situation here as we're trying to tilt the world in the direction we might like?
I think on the one hand, you have this ugly mirror of the capitalist system. The most ugly mirror of the capitalist situation today is there because we have a genocide televised, which is crazy. I never have thought in my life, even being against imperialism, against capitalism, I would watch a genocide. It's the ugly mirror of this world is in the genocide. The other side of the mirror is the hopeful aspect, the resistance global. There's a new generation worldwide speaking with one voice. There is no sectarianism. There is working together with students, occupations, like, for example, maybe one doesn't know in the United States, but the occupation, the encampments in the United States, inspired in Belgium the encampments. Wow, it's a global movement from Jakarta to London, etc. And this movement of global hope, that's also the global mutiny. And I think in the Palestinian movement, in the pro-Palestinian movement, there is already the conjunction between the mutiny of the North and the South. That's happening in the solidarity movement for Palestine. So on the one hand, the ugly genocidal side of capitalism in the system. On the other hand, signs of hope, signs of coming together, new and youth generations in the global North and the global South.
Finally, before we let you go here, you mentioned, and very correctly, that, collective struggle has always been the engine of progress, anywhere in the world and everywhere in the world. So I wonder, how important is it to you that we really also reach back and remember our own historical traditions of struggle, so much of which I feel like, have been washed away or whitewashed in the context of our current society?
Oh, totally. It's a very important thing because in order to become working class that's proud on itself, you have to have both. You have to have a consciousness about what the working class in the past had already achieved. And there's a lot of things, there would be still child labor in most of the countries without a working class. There would be illiteracy in most of the countries without the working class achieved it all. The end of, in some situations, the end of child labor, the end of illiteracy, all we ever achieved is thanks to the working class. So there's that one. And that means also not regards to the history. It certainly means regards to the future, because the situation in which the working class created this advantage was sometimes even worse than today. They always said it is impossible. They said it is impossible to abolish slavery, and then there was anti-slavery, and they abolished it. They said it was impossible to finish child labor in Belgium and in Europe, and then the labor movement, they did it. And they say today it's impossible to end a genocide in Israel, and now it's the global movement, and they will end it. And so I think the much more we are conscious of our own proud history as a working class, the much more we are hopeful and yes, hopeful for the future.
Right on. Well, Peter, I really enjoyed reading the book. Very thought-provoking. Mutiny, How Our World is Tilting. You can get it at 1804books.com. Looking forward to talking with you more about it later this evening. People's Forum, 6:30 p.m. If you're watching this show live, go to the People's Forum YouTube and see us talk more. Peter, thanks so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I listen. If you haven't been to 1804books.com, I don't know what you're doing, but as you can see, we got a lot of heat on deck. There are a lot of things we put out over the past year that are fantastic. There's a lot more that's going to be coming out over the next year, so make sure you check that out. And like I said, if you're watching this live, if you're not watching it live, you can go to the People's Forum YouTube and watch it as well. You just will be watching it later, but please check that out. We're going to have a great conversation, hybrid conversation here between myself and Peter about Mutiny, How Our World is Tilting. Well, to finish the show here, certainly last but absolutely not least, the story that has really, I think, captivated much of the world, the martial law declaration in South Korea by President Yoon and the response of the South Korean people that seems to have beaten that back, at least for now. But, I'm not going to give you the details. We're going to bring in someone who really knows what they're talking about. Dae-Han Song, who leads the contents team of the International Strategy Center, is also a part of the No Cold War Collective and an associate at the Korea Policy Institute, is here with us. Dae-Han, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me on the show, Eugene.
Listen, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. I mean, there's so much to say here. I don't even know where to start. Maybe I'll just start here. Uh, what was behind this attempted martial law? I mean, what was Yoon hoping to accomplish? And what does it say that it was so, reversed so quickly? Because it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, just immense popular outrage in South Korea.
Sure. I think a lot of us were pretty shocked when the martial law was called. I was at a funeral and I remember that just everybody was like, oh my God, like, on their phones, it's just popping and saying, like, UNES just declared martial law, right? None of us believed it. And I mean, the reversal, of course, has to do with the mobilization of people, right? Like people just mobilized rapidly. When I dropped off those people, like they immediately just rushed to the National Assembly, right? Activists, organizers, just common people, right? I've heard that stories about delivery drivers that just stopped their deliveries and they just like rushed over people that were just relaxing at home when they saw the declaration. They just rushed over, and basically within an hour people were already trickling in, and by 12 a.m. there were thousands of people already in front of the National Assembly. And of course it was these people in front of the National Assembly that actually prevented the armored trucks from entering the National Assembly grounds, and basically struggled with the special forces soldiers to prevent them from blocking the vote that happened, that actually rescinded the martial law, right? A lot of them outside were chanting, abolish martial law, down with the dictatorship, all of this while the assembly members were voting to revoke the martial law, right? So there's also a lot of reporting that says that the soldiers that were mobilized, a lot of them afterwards, as they demobilized, they like apologized to the crowd, all of this. I mean, I think all of this is only possible because people so rapidly showed up and showed that President Yoon is illegitimate, that nobody supports this declaration of martial law, that is completely ridiculous. Yeah, and I think so. The people, in effect, played a crucial role. As regards to like what led Yoon to do this, basically he was backed into a corner, right? He was rapidly becoming a lame duck president, right? A budget bill that he was trying to pass, which would have increased his discretionary spending for the presidential office, for the prosecutor's office, which he controls, right? A lot of this was being blocked in the National Assembly. Also, like a lot of the accusations around stock manipulation and bribery that around his wife, around the first lady, were also just dominating the news, becoming even bigger. And also, it was just a matter of time before there was going to be a vote in the National Assembly that would have overturned Yoon's veto that he had been exercising on the special investigation on her and on him that would likely have passed the National Assembly. So he was basically backed into a corner, and I think he just thought that this was his only way.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I think is important here, and at least from my view outside looking in, about people mobilizing so rapidly is people in, South Korea, they know what martial law means and the long struggle over many years to have, the right to have elections, democratic rights, the many people who were killed. I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about that as well, because I think most people in the United States, at least, are pretty ignorant about, I think, that period of South Korea's history.
Sure. The last time that martial law was declared was in 1980, May 17, 1980. And this was basically against a lot of the protests by students that started with students and kind of spread to the larger public that were calling for democracy, right, to the end of the dictatorship. And of course, like direct presidential elections happened in 1988 amidst protests, democratization protests. And so, yeah, it was wild, right? Nobody thought that within a lot of the younger people, nobody thought that within their lifetimes, in this day of age of like in Korea, like somebody would declare martial law, right? And of course, I think very important is that 1980 martial law was what prolonged the dictatorship, right? And of course, what they used to justify it was that there's like North Korean infiltration, that there's like anti-state forces, and of course, Yoon was doing that again this time. And the thing that both of them have in common is that there was no threat, right? There was no North Korean infiltration. It was a complete. It was just a way to basically increase their legitimacy, hold on to power, right? Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it very. I've certainly. It's amazing, really, that they we would do this. I was myself shocked, given that history and everything that had gone past. But here we are. It seems like President Yoon is trying to hang on, and interestingly enough, his party, which was leadership at least, was critical. Now is saying, well, we're going to defend him from being impeached. I mean, you can't predict the future, so it's hard to say. I mean, do you think that is tenable, or given how sort of extreme this step was, that Yoon will ultimately have to step down?
Sure. Well, I think a couple of things is important to know, right? For example, the Conservative Party already had two presidents, or one president impeached while in office and incarcerated, President Park Geun-hye, and another president, Lee Myung-bak, uh, imprisoned after he left office, right? So if Yoon is also in prison, that's a massive existential blow to them, right? So even as they're acknowledging that declaring martial law, that there were no, it was insufficient grounds to declare martial law. Despite that, they're also saying that they're not gonna uh, vote for the impeachment motion, right? And I think at this point, what is key is people's mobilization, right? Like right after on Thursday, right after martial law was lifted, there were protests that were happening in Seoul, and these protests need to keep getting bigger. There's going to be a protest every night, and it's going to culminate on Saturday when people from all across the country are going to be coming in and congregating in Gwanghwamun, which is Seoul's main plaza, right? And I think a lot of this is just reminiscent of the 2016, 2017 candlelight protests that brought down President Park Geun-hye that was in power at that time, right? And it's just clear that politicians will only move when there is sufficient people in the streets, when there's sufficient protests, right, and rallies to keep. There's so many bureaucratic moments, bureaucratic pitfalls that could prevent the process from happening, right? And of course, these are all safeguards to power, right? But I think when people are there and keep pushing the process forward, I think that's what's gonna make sure that corruption and abuse of power are like held accountable.
No, I think that's a very relevant point. The State Department has made their announcement today saying the U.S. South Korea relationship transcends any particular president. So I think, there's sort of, I don't know if that's distance or not, but certainly seeming to say that they maybe are not going to rally to Yoon's cause. I mean, I wonder if what you think the repercussions could potentially be. I mean, obviously, President Yoon has been very much in lockstep with the United States on, the military issues in Northeast Asia, other pieces like that. If him being in turmoil, possibly being moved off the scene by a popular protest movement, how that might affect some of the geopolitical elements that have been heavily pushed by him, the Biden administration, and the Japanese government over the past few years.
Sure. I think the Yoon administration, almost like from the beginning, was losing a lot of popularity and legitimacy because he started. There's a whole history of like Japan never had been held accountable for its war crimes and its during colonialism, during its imperialist war. They weren't held accountable, and of course that's connected to a whole long history also of like U.S. intervention in the region and the U.S. basically allowing Japan off the hook, uh, in order to prop up a power in the region that could anti-communist power, right? But I guess the impact would be it would be big, right? Because the last time there was a shift from a conservative to a liberal president, that's also a period that opened up a lot of like rapprochement with North Korea, right? When inter-Korean relationships started to improve. And that's also when basically Moon Jae-in, that came after Park Geun-hye, right, came with the mandate to change Korean society. And one of the things he started doing was he started building peaceful relations, improving relations with North Korea. And of course, that paved the way for Trump to be able to have the different summits with Kim Jong-un. And that could also be a likely possibility, right? I think one important point to note, though, is that I think at the end of the day, basically the people need to be out in the streets. Progressive movements need to mobilize around around a progressive agenda that does involve like a more balanced approach in the region, as opposed to Yoon's such a strong, heavy pro United States centered approach that also involves like reaching out to North Korea, trying to repair a lot of the damage that was done under the Yoon administration. And just also pushing a lot of progressive agendas around like democratic reforms, right? This is the second time that it's happening, right? It's like it happened in 2016, it's happening again in 2024. Like there has to be democratic reforms to limit the power of the president that is just too excessive, to limit the power of the prosecutor's office. These democratic reforms need to happen to prevent this from happening again.
Well, we're going to be watching this closely. This is, I think one of the most interesting stories that's out there in the world today. And we really appreciate you, Dae-Han Song of the International Strategy Center, being willing to join us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Well, that brings us to the end of our show today. I do have an announcement for those of you who are watching on YouTube, and I think it's probably because of some of you who are watching now. Breakthrough News, youtube.com/breakthrough news. We have reached 900,000 subscribers. I don't have like a button to do any sort of sound. I don't know if they do in the booth, but I'm just golf clapping here because I don't want it to be too loud, and applauding you all for all of your support, for everyone who has spread our work around. I mean, certainly everyone who's become a patron, everyone who's donating, but really even everyone who has just sent a link to somebody, told someone to watch the show, turn it onto your TV if you're watching on Free Speech TV, whatever you've done to help build us and build the brand. We just want to salute you and thank everybody who's been following Breakthrough News here since 2020. And we're going to continue this journey and keep pushing forward. And we could certainly use your assistance. So if you can, please go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. I know, it's a tough time for a lot of people, so anything that you can do will be greatly appreciated. Recurring donations make the biggest difference, even if it seems like a small amount of money. When we all come together, it's a large amount of money. I don't know what the number is. What is 900,000 times? I'm not even going to do it, but, times that by 2, and if every single person subscribing, you would see it'd be a huge amount of money. So ultimately, long story short, even if you don't have a lot or you feel you don't have a lot, you're making a big difference. So patreon.com/breakthrough news. You have the last few seconds here to hit the like button. As Rania would say, smash that like button. Helps us in the algorithm, and we definitely need that. I think, as you can imagine, we're not counting on Alphabet, Meta, whoever, X for sure, to boost us to many more people. So we need your assistance in making that possible. And also a big shout out, as always, to our friends at Free Speech TV, who make it possible for us to appear to you on their platform as well. So keep supporting them however you can. But that will bring us to the close of this edition of The Freedom Side. Rania Khalek was out this week. She will be back again with us next week. So for myself, for Rania, even in absentia, and the whole Breakthrough News team, we will see you next time.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.